Just a short disclaimer before I move on with the rest of this tutorial, and I suppose the rest of the series. My voice isn't completely back up to scratch quite yet. I'm recovering from a cold which I've had over the last 2 weeks or so. So I'm not speaking as clearly as I would like to, but hopefully it's still enough for you guys to understand what I'm saying, and hopefully we can continue with this. Up until now, we've essentially been doing some 2D work. We actually haven't created 3D anything just yet, but that 2D work was necessary for the rest of this series to work. I have a blank scene here in Cinema 4D, and I'm going to merge this with one of the traces that we got from Illustrator at the beginning of the series. So here we go. I'm just going to click OK, and it's the original trace that we created at the very beginning. I want to go to the front view here, and I just want to take all these outlines. Let me pull them out of the null object here. Let's drag it out. And I just want to move this to somewhere close to the center of the scene here. And the way I'm lining this up is using this V shape needs to be aligned with this center line here. So let's just pull this a little bit to the left. And then I'm using just these grids as a rough guide to the up and down middle as well. Okay, in the perspective viewport, let me delete this null. We don't need it anymore. But let me get the extrude object, and if I take all the outlines, drop them in here, you can see now we're starting to generate some 3D geometry. If you go to the extrude object, you want to go to the object tab and make sure that hierarchical is ticked. Or hierarchical. And one thing I like to always do at this stage is to press T just to bring up the scaling tool, and just make this smaller until the height, which is the Y size over here, is something closer to 200. And this is something that I do with logos that I work with in Cinema 4D. I will always normalize the height to 200 centimeters, just because when I do other operations later, which includes other values and changing scales and so on, with 200 as the base sort of height, I can ballpark everything else a lot easier later on. And if you are trying to follow this tutorial exactly as I'm doing it here, then you will also want to work with the same scale, so that later when I tell you to use certain numbers and certain values, your result will be the same as what I'm using as well. Okay, in the extrude, I'm just going to go to the object tab still. And under movement, this is where you do the depth of the extrusion. So I'm going to set this to 20. And the subdivision is basically how many times you want to cut this up, going into Z space. And then we can go to the caps tab. And in here we have a lot of controls. And I'm just going to give you an extended guide of what this is all about. So the start here just refers to the front, and the end refers to the back of the logo. So I'm going to put a fillet cap on both, and I'll set the radius to 1 and 1. And this just adds a beveled edge to the logo here. And we can set the steps to something like maybe 5 and 5, so that it's rounded like this. And if you are planning to do close-ups, you might perhaps use a higher number of segments so that you don't lose some resolution on the edges there. Another control which is often overlooked is this constrain tick box down here. And what it does is it basically constrains the volume of the logo to not go past the boundary of the original outline. So let me show you what I'm talking about. If I untick this again and set the radius of the front cap to say 10, that's a bit extreme, but it illustrates what I'm talking about. Now you can see the volume of the logo has grown beyond the borders of the original outlines, and it's intersecting with itself in a lot of places. So this is where you would tick constrain, and now it's contained within the original boundaries, so there will be no intersecting, at least into other parts of the logo. But you may start to see other intersections happening on the individual pieces, like here, for example. So this does have its limits when you are using extremely high values, but it will work to a certain point. So like here, anything up to 5 centimeters is still fine in a lot of places. I have a nice bevel and the logo is retaining its original shape, and that is the difference. Perhaps you won't need this as much if you're working with lower numbers, such as just 1 centimeter on the front and back. Constraining will not make much of a difference, but you might still use it just to keep the logo as close to the original shape as possible. Something else you can play around with is the fillet type. So the default is convex, which basically means it's curved outward. You also have other modes such as concave, which is the opposite of convex. It curves inward instead. And that can be an interesting look in different applications, but in this case, I'll probably just stick to convex and play around with the other modes and see what they do. You might prefer that look or find another use for it. Okay, all the way down here we have something called type. And the default setting is n-gons. An n-gon is basically any shape which has more than 4 sides. A 3-sided shape is a tri, a 4-sided shape is a quad, and an n-gon is anything which has 5 or more sides. And basically that's what our logo is currently being made up of. You have these shapes here which have more than 4 sides each. So the V section here is made up of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11 different sides. And then these other pieces are made up of even more, because even though this may look like one side, each segment here which breaks this up is counted as a side. Now as far as working with logos go, it's not really something you need to think about too much. But there are some cases where you might want to explore the other types of arranging your polygons and these shapes. So for example, I can change this to quadrangles, which basically means 4-sided shapes. And now you can see this is now trying to cut this up into these 4-sided shapes. So the V has been broken up into all these different parts, and the curved areas have also been broken up. And you can take this further, take a regular grid, and the surface is going to be divided up even further. And you can change the width here to basically change the threshold of the minimum amount of surface area on which a new segment will be generated. So you could take this down to something like 1, and now the surface is made up of these tiny little squares. So let's bring this back up to 5. And what I want to try and do now is make this entire logo to be made up of these squares. You can see the back is also made up of squares, but the sides are still just these giant singular shapes, and we want to fix that. I'm gonna go to the steps here. I'm just gonna change this to 3 and 3. I don't want too much on the sides there. If I go back to the Object tab, I can set the subdivisions to say maybe just 5 going into Z space. And that's the first step to creating more subdivisions on the sides here. The other step involves going back to the splines. So if you select all of these, under the Object tab, you want to go to where it says intermediate points. And by default, this is set to adaptive, which basically says that where it needs more segments, it will allocate more to those areas. So the curved area has more segments than the straight areas, as you can see here. It has more divisions going across because you need them to define that curved shape. We want to change this to something which will force segments even onto the straight areas. So I'm going to set the intermediate points to subdivided, and these two values will work together to set thresholds on when to create a new segment. So the angle, if you increase or decrease this, that will give you less or more segments. If it's higher, you will get less segments. But then there's also the maximum length value, which basically asks how much distance there should be before a new segment is created. So let's set this to something like 5, which basically means every 5 centimeters there is going to be a new segment. So you can set this to something like maybe just 3, and the squares on the sides will start to look a bit more like the squares on the front. We're basically trying to distribute these polygons as evenly as possible across the face of the logo there. And this is the end result. Now, as far as this project we're working on is concerned, this isn't that relevant, but it is very good technical knowledge to know. If you recall a while back, there was a tutorial in which I did a particle reveal effect on a logo. And part of that process involved dividing up the logo into segments just like this before I could break it up again and do the reveal effect. So that's an example of a practical use for what I've just shown you. And there's many more applications for this, but I definitely just wanted to give you an in-depth guide to the Extrude Object and also different spline modes and how you can basically combine what I've just shown you to suit many different situations. But that's it for this part. I'll see you next time when we're gonna start doing some manual modeling.